It was an ordinary day. The sun was shining while four men sat around a table, intensely focusing on the card game at hand. The game was bridge, a strategic card game using a standard 52 card deck and 4 players. 2 separate teams with the players sitting across from each other, using elements of bidding and strategy. The goal? For one of the 2 teams to win tricks and score points decided during the bidding phase. It's a popular game played competitively, worldwide. Only this was no ordinary setting, and these were no ordinary men playing the game of bridge. This was death row at San Quentin State Prison, and the 4 players seated at the table across from each other were infamous serial killers. William Bonin, the freeway killer, Lawrence Bittaker, one of the toolbox killers, or better known as Pliers Bittaker, Doug Clark, the Sunset Strip killer, and Randy Kraft, the scorecard killer. Altogether, the 4 serial killers were convicted of a total of just under 50 victims, but with a suggested body count of nearly 100 total. 4 of the most deadly murderers in American history, all seated together around a steel table in yard number 4 in the east block of the prison, playing game after game of one of the most recognized and notorious card games, bridge, in one of the most deadliest clubs to be associated with, the San Quentin Bridge Club. Welcome to Murder Wall. My name is Daniel Hart. I'm your host and your true crime storyteller. Every week we'll take a deep dive into some of the true crime stories surrounding some of the most notorious and unknown murderers and murder cases around the world. Today and over the next 4 weeks, we'll be covering the story of the San Quentin Bridge Club, the infamous killer card club made of William Bonin, Lawrence Bittaker, Randy Kraft, and Douglas Clark. All serial killers placed on death row for the related deadly crimes. We'll focus on the stories surrounding this club, but in the weeks ahead, we'll dive into each of their respective crime stories. A sensitive listening warning due to the show's exploration into graphic topics, examining the details and methods of murderers and their crimes. Some of these topics can be sensitive and upsetting to some listeners, and some might find offensive. This is Murder Wall. In 1990, there was a Vanity Fair article that wrote a story surrounding 4 serial killers on death row playing a civilized game of bridge daily in prison yard number 4. And it was this story that shed a light on something much more sinister to the naked eye. That these 4 serial killers were probably some of the most evil, sadistic killers known to the modern world in American true crime history. They were said to have killed over 60, but some speculate that combined number probably reached well over 100. Randy Kraft, known as the scorecard killer, notably because of the scorecard type card found in his possession during his arrest of murder, a card that, interesting enough, shared more than 60 cryptic messages linking possibly to each of his victims, a way that he kept track. He was convicted of murdering 16 men, but this number keeps rising as numerous other victims are being discovered in later years and being linked to Kraft due to DNA evidence. This cryptic scorecard began to be cracked by some of the prosecutors, with some of the names on the card stating Marine Carson, pointing to the murder of a young Marine named Richard Keith, last seen in Carson, California. Or another example on the scorecard was Jail Out, pointing to the murder case of a young man named Ronald Young, a victim found stabbed to death after his release from Orange County Jail back in 1978. Based on his scorecard, his murders would number into the 60s, making him one of the worst serial killers in U.S. history. William Bonin killed 14 young men and boys between 1979 and 1980. He was dubbed the Freeway Killer because he would dump the bodies along the freeways around Los Angeles. It was revealed in a television interview that Bonin openly admitted participating in 21 murders. Others closely associated with Bonin shared details of the torture inflicted to the victims, sharing that Bill loved the sounds of screams. Bonin was one of the most brutal killers. While strangulation was the most common method for his killing, he would also stab his victims with knives or ice picks and would typically torture them. The unusual part on Bonin's case was that his dumping and active grounds for his murders often overlapped with Randy Kraft's. Both were known as the Freeway Killer during a period of several murders, and investigators discovered that the methods were clearly different between them and identified that there were two killers at work in the area at the same time, eventually agreeing that 16 of the other murders originally tied to Bonin were eventually solved with the arrest of Kraft in 1983. And later that same year, Bonin waited to greet Kraft at San Quentin State Prison, idolizing Kraft almost like his biggest fan, waiting to welcome him home. Lawrence Bittaker, the third member of the club, committed 5 murders in 1979, raping and murdering young girls, organizing a plan to kill age victims 13 through 19, all while recording the events on tape. Using the back of a van they transformed into their torture vehicle, dubbing it the Murder Mac. He was nicknamed Pliers Bittaker, making note of one of the tools used in his torture. He was one half of what was known as the toolbox killers, because they would use assorted tools as their killing weapons, ranging from sledgehammers, ice picks, and of course, pliers. Bittaker was cruel, often abducting his victims with force and using the loud music from the van to drown out their screams. Tape recordings of one of the victims' last moments were recovered in Bittaker's van and were so horrifying that some of the jurors and attorneys couldn't listen. On top of that, over 500 photos were discovered as evidence, and nearly 30 to 40 victims were thought to be linked to the toolbox killers. But in the end, it was the 5 murders that landed Bittaker on death row, with an additional sentence of 199 years and 4 months, just in case Bittaker was ever released on appeal. And the 4th member of the club was Douglas Clark, one half of the murderous duo known as the Sunset Killers. He was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, plus 1 count each of attempted murder, mayhem, and mutilating human remains. His dark side kept his mind centered around rape, mutilation, and necrophilia. And when he met his counterpart, Carol Bundy, it was like a deadly match. The couple yearned for kinky sex and darker fantasies, and on one said occasion, Clark had stored a severed head inside the refrigerator and played a game of cosmetics. Of course, with Carol, having her use makeup on it until Clark became tired of the game, and he took the head with him into the bathroom where he showered and performed sex on the head. 4 of the worst killers, 4 in the club, but not 4 of the best of friends. More after this. Hello, Dan here, host of Murder Wall. I want to personally thank you for stopping by, checking out the new podcast. We'll aim to bring you new stories every Monday on something that we're going to be dubbing Murder Monday, and hope that you come along. Consider subscribing and dropping us a note. You can find us on numerous podcasting apps, including Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and a host of others as we're working to get on all those platforms. We don't just look at Murder Wall as a podcast, but rather as a true crime community. So if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, we love to hear from you. Consider dropping us a comment if you like, or you can also reach us at murderwallpodcast@gmail.com. That's murderwallpodcast@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening. And without any further delay, let's get back to the story. Every day, between the hours of 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., the San Quentin Bridge Club would meet in the yard and gather around the steel table to play the strategic card game. While other inmates would gather around or sit on the ground surrounding the table, it was clear that the table belonged to the Bridge Club, and nobody would cross for the notorious serial killers, but not because they were friends. In fact, the serial killers despised each other. So much so that Randy Kraft and William Bonin were reported as completely loathing each other and refused to be partners in the game. So as the story goes, Bonin also hated Doug Clark. So he would team up with Lawrence Bittaker and Kraft would team up with Clark. The teams were set and they never changed. Randy Kraft was known as the best player out of the group and was known for his bridge playing skills. It was a game he loved to play, so much so that in his murder trial, his defense attorneys tried to use the excuse that Kraft couldn't have committed at least 2 of the murders that he was charged with because he was playing bridge at the time of the murders. And Bonin, he was known as the least skilled in the game. The entire group was noted as having high IQs, but Bonin, not as much. He still liked to relish his control of the game by reportedly sabotaging hands, frustrating his partner Bittaker in the process, who would lose patience at his schemes. Then there was Randy Kraft, playing his hand by the book, methodically making his plays, resenting any noise or distraction, and completely focused on his cards, never overreaching or overbidding, totally under control. Conversation during the game was at a minimum. And the interesting fact was that the cards themselves had no numbers. Since the prison banned numbered playing cards, the cards were homemade. Betting was also off limits. And the game would go on for hours and hours, day after day. And the one most despised in the group was probably Bonin. The freeway killer was usually the center of jokes, and Clark's attitude towards Bonin usually had him directing his jokes towards him. Kraft and Bittaker would often join in the mistreatment, but the game would go on. Until February 23rd, 1996, when the infamous bridge playing quartet was reduced by 1, when Bonin was executed in the gas chamber. There was an interesting article posted in Psychology Today, and in that article it talked about other serial killers engaging in games, deep thinking, strategy games, in some ways kind of like the game of bridge being played by the San Quentin Bridge Club. The article talked about how infamous serial killer Ted Bundy was a good chess player. Not only was he a good player in chess, but reportedly he was also a good teacher of chess, having one of his former dates tell a story of how patient Bundy was, telling her how important it was to think careful before touching any piece, that a single careless move could win or lose the game. In another episode, we'll dive into another interesting story of the Bitsetsky maniac, the Moscow serial killer Alexander Pichushkin, or better known as the chessboard killer. A chess-playing murderer who had a goal to murder one person for each of the 64 squares on the chessboard. Just another killer tied to the mind game of chess. And even further, we may take a deeper dive into the life of serial killer Michael Fournier, better known as the Ogre of the Aidens, and murder of 9 women and girls. He was known as a man who liked to play mind games and a skillful chess player, so much so that he was even allowed to have a chess computer in his cell. And among all the deep-thinking serial killer mind game fanatics, we have Dennis Rader, or the BTK killer, who doesn't just play one game of chess, but plays several games at once in his cell, an apparent quest to be a master. Mind games and serial killers almost seem to go hand in hand, and it's with no surprise when we hear about the Bridge Club at San Quentin and the infamous serial killers that made up the teams and the manner in which they played. 4 killers strategically sitting around the table in the prison yard, playing the most civilized game with some of the most uncivil murderers in history, with completely unmarked cards. Now, that is one to ponder. So as we start this journey into this new podcast, Murder Wall, we'll call this episode 0, a launching pad, if you will, a short introduction into a true crime journey surrounding the story centered around murder, serial killers, spree killers, famous cold cases, both solved and unsolved cases from the past to the present. Some of the stories might have garnered larger headlines and are more known, but we'll also dive into some of the lesser known or smaller cases that might have gained little to no attention from the press. These, of course, are a little harder to research and tell the full story, but we'll go on this journey together. Again, we're always open to any ideas, any suggestions, and of course, keeping things relatively respectful towards victims and those related to these true crime stories. So, following this episode, tune in next week as we take a deeper dive into the San Quentin Bridge Club. For the next 4 weeks, we'll go a little further into each of the club's serial killer members. And next Monday, we'll cover the story of the scorecard killer, Randy Kraft. This production was written, produced, and recorded by me, myself, and I, Daniel Hart, your host and true crime storyteller. See you next time. This is Murder Wall.